Metal Gear Solid is a game of contradictions. Hyper-real military jargon is paired with campy dialogue, and incredibly linear levels allow for incredibly non-linear dynamics. It's a series which simultaneously explores and negates the interactive properties of video games, constantly pushing what is possible and what is acceptable. Now, the latest, and possibly last entry in the Metal Gear Solid series, presents perhaps the greatest contradiction of all. As the final installment in a nearly 30-year franchise, Metal Gear Solid 5 somehow feels like the beginning of a completely new one. The game slots into the timeline between 2010's Peace Walker and 1987's Metal Gear, and sees the legendary soldier Big Boss, father to future series protagonist Solid Snake, sent on a rescue mission to recover two of his soldiers from enemy hands. After doing a bunch of sneaking, ramen eating, and human beehive, freaky lizard man, elderly sniper, ghost, angry spaceman, former mentor, and giant robot fighting, Big Boss is well on his way to becoming the 8-bit cartoon villain we saw in the original NES title. Being the final link in the Metal Gear Solid chain is not an easy title to live up to, and unfortunately this sequel baggage drags the game down a little. It's hard to imagine Kojima had this grand vision in mind while working on the original games back in the 80s, so it's forgivable that not every single plot thread is tied up nicely. But the plot here almost feels like a side story, rather than a vital chunk of the Metal Gear continuity. The tone has shifted as well. The plot takes itself very seriously, and relegates much of the background information and exposition to optional cassette tapes. No doubt this will be a positive for the many people tired of sitting through hours of codec conversations, but it leaves the plot and characters without any personality or life. Kiefer Sutherland's performance as Snake is dry and minimal, which fits the state of the character, but it doesn't hold a candle to the range and charisma of David Hayter. It has some interesting things to say about colonialism, language, and as usual, war and nuclear weapons. But these themes are almost on the periphery, as the main plot is concerned with the destructive, all-consuming, and let's face it, a little overplayed, theme of revenge. Fortunately, the game more than makes up for its disappointing plot in almost every other way. Ground Zeroes, sold separately, forms the first part of Metal Gear Solid 5, and serves as an excellent introduction to the game. It's visually distinct from the rest of the missions, and provides you with just enough of a sandbox to experiment with the basic mechanics, without getting overwhelmed. It's a wise design choice given how much of the basic control scheme has changed since Snake's last outing. He can now sprint and dive, and has access to a reflex mode which occurs when you're spotted, giving you a chance to eliminate the offending soldier before they can raise the alarm. It's an incredibly well realised mechanic. It keeps things challenging without slowing down the flow of gameplay, by forcing you to hide and wait for an alert timer to count down. Another important tool introducing Ground Zeroes is the binoculars, which are an optional extra in previous games, but absolutely essential in this one. With them, you can survey the battlefield and mark enemies, resources, and vehicles so they are visible even through walls and during storms. It makes hanging back and surveying the landscape a viable, even essential strategy. The non-lethal approach also becomes legitimate once more with the Fulton recovery system returning from Peace Walker. This device, available in the second main part of Metal Gear Solid 5, subtitled The Phantom Pain, not only removes enemies from the area, preventing them from being discovered and raising an alarm, but also adds them to your growing personal army. This mother-based system is at the centre of what makes Metal Gear Solid 5 such a fascinating, dynamic, and unique gameplay experience. By bringing soldiers and resources from the field back to Mother Base, you can slowly upgrade its various sections to aid you during missions, whether it's through new weapons and tools, weather reports, or supply drops. Excitingly, and importantly, this system works both ways. Enemy soldiers will adapt to your strategies and weapons, wearing helmets if you rely on headshots too much, or equipping night vision goggles if you attack at night too often. You can then invest money, or GMP, into sending out teams to disrupt their supply chains, giving you a temporary advantage for a few missions. There is a constant shift in power between you and the enemy, with neither having the upper hand for too long. You develop new weapons, tools, and strategies, they adapt, and you disrupt. It's a system that feeds back into itself, encouraging experimentation and ensuring that every action you take has a consequence. It also means that your approach to missions can be highly diverse, and despite the fact that your objectives simply rotate between assassinating targets and rescuing prisoners, the sheer amount of ways you can approach these tasks makes each experience rich, dynamic, and memorable. An important element of this system are the buddies you can collect over the course of the game, AI-controlled allies which can be outfitted to either a stealth or assault approach. My stealthy playstyle meant I usually focused on D-Dog's ability to spot and mark enemies, but after spending a few missions with Quiet, I was able to upgrade her enough to silently take out enemies or provide a loud distraction. The sheer amount of freedom you have in interacting with and influencing this larger mechanical system is Metal Gear Solid 5's greatest strength, even if the limited mission structures can be tiresome the further you get into the game. As dynamic and freeing as this system is, pursuing the same objective over and over is inevitably going to get boring. While in previous Metal Gear games the core loop of avoiding and engaging enemies was broken up with boss fights, the encounters in this game are actually some of its most tedious sections. While in cutscenes these characters are presented as dangerous and intimidating, when it comes down to actually fighting them, your strategic options are essentially limited to an all-out assault or running away from the fight completely. The mysterious Skulls Parasite unit, as well as the terrifying Man on Fire and Third Child, are essentially indestructible, which means that fighting them breaks down to shooting them a lot until they're either incapacitated or you have a chance to escape. There's no attack patterns, no special weaknesses, no strategy. Even the most interesting fight in the game, an early encounter with Quiet, is essentially an expanded version of previous fights with Sniper Wolf or the End. There's homage and then there's uninspired. While they succeed in making these characters a force to be reckoned with, it's at the cost of struggle, strategy, and closure. These characters aren't defeated, they're postponed, and eventually just fizzle out in the plot, with little explanation as to where they went or why they stopped trying to fight you. While the rest of the experience is constantly prodding and pushing you to experiment with new tools and strategies, these boss fights basically entail you bashing your head against a wall, hoping it will crack. Metal Gear Solid 5 feels like the beginning of a new era. Its de-emphasis on plot is, for me, a step backwards, but its gameplay is without a doubt the pinnacle of the series, and full of potential. In the end, Metal Gear Solid 5's weakness is the Metal Gear moniker. Without such a rich and long legacy to live up to, perhaps this would have been a bold new step for Kojima, an evolution in his design and production sensibilities. But it's clear that the developers made the game they wanted to make first, and then tried to force it into a Metal Gear shaped mold. This isn't to say it's a bad video game. It's a fantastic video game. It's just a bad Metal Gear Solid game. Who knows, with a little more development time and support from Konami, this could have been a revolution for both Kojima and Metal Gear. It's just a shame that it all had to end here.
He's coming too. Roger that.